Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of Structures Describing a System in Real Time. So good to see you again. So, without any further ado, I'm going to jump right into it where we left off last week because we have got a lot of ground to cover and only 3 more episodes. So, as usual, let me open up my Things app and open the tags. So, here we are. And let's see. We are going to open up our themes, which are nested, set of nested tags. And, let's see. We went through a bunch last week and we ended with meditation. Right. So, where we're going to start today is memory. Right. Well, so this is a quick recap. This summer I finally read the management and self-help guru David Allen's Getting Things Done, and I started to implement some of his tools into my life. In particular, in early August, I woke up one morning and started to add a bunch of things into my Things task management app. So I really like the tags function because it lets you create these flexible tags that you can use to tag anything else, any task. So here we go. So, I've been thinking about the functions of memory for a couple decades. It's probably the influence of my high school girlfriend who had a major influence on me and whose whole college thesis was actually about memory. But, anyways, like enough of those old, somewhat painful memories. I've been starting to work through some of the more theoretical ideas around memory that are very relevant in my work today. And, you know, I've read somewhere, I don't remember exactly where, that studies show that every time you access a particular memory, you also change that memory. So the most true memories are those that you have remembered the least often. And one of the books that's most influenced my thinking over the past 6 months is the psychologist and trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk's "The Body Keeps the Score." And in a podcast I listened to with him on Krista Tippett's On Being, this is how I was first introduced to his ideas. He mentions that, as studies have shown, people who suffer from PTSD have memories of their traumatic experiences that are essentially static or fixed. What that means is that whenever they remember those traumas, they're transported immediately back into the moment of their original experience. Their body kind of goes back into that state. And they're unable to integrate these traumatic experiences into the rest of their life narratives. Whereas people who don't have PTSD smooth out the details, particularly the negative parts, so their past memories get integrated into their current life story. And his example is from studies of World War II war veterans. And I'm simplifying, but basically, for those veterans who didn't suffer PTSD in the war, when they were asked 40 years later about their war experiences, they would remember it as a great, exciting experience. Whereas those who experienced severe trauma and suffer from PTSD, even if it wasn't even, barely diagnosed back then, for them, the memories remained nearly unchanged. So they were completely fixed. They were stuck in the past moment of pain and their inability to do anything about it. And so it's just like this loop. It's a terrible loop of memories that you can't change. And it's pretty powerful stuff. But in a way, if I were to rephrase this, it's like memory, if it's functioning well and it's not traumatized, well, memory is actually about forgetting. Mixing typefaces. Oh, this is a good one. I really love mixing typefaces. I mean, it's not possible in Things yet, and I guess I can see why they wouldn't want to add a function to change the typeface of the interface. I mean, it'd probably only satisfy a couple of anti-modernist geeks like me. But you can always wish for things in the world. But I mean, here's the thing: if you look at the canonized design work of the European avant-garde of 100 years ago, much of it was wildly experimental and eclectic. Like, it's exuberant, it's heterogeneous. I mean, I think of something like El Lissitzky and Hans Arp's book, Die Kunstismen, The Isms of Art, and it juxtaposes many different typographic voices and hand-lettered voices. And it's particularly appropriate to the book, which was a 1925 roundup of all the different movements of the European avant-garde, but most importantly, it reflects to me a kind of non-dogmatic approach that emphasizes plurality and testing out new things over settling on singular systems. But I mean, a lot of things have changed, and or a lot of things did change. And if you fast forwarded about 30 or 40 years from that point, much of the most lionized design of the European context, um, uh, you know, tried to argue for a reduction of the typographic palette. So, for example, like there were arguments in favor of using only one typeface, maybe in a couple of different weights, bold, regular, and light, but maybe even only in a single weight. For me, for example, the apogee of this approach is Odell Eicher's brilliantly realized, but also exceptionally monovocal design for the 1972 Munich Olympics, which mostly uses one typeface, one weight for all of the communications. Now, you also see this kind of strict reduction to a single family, a single structure around the most famous Swiss design of the mid-century period, such as, Bauhaus-trained Max Bill being a very obvious example of this. But it's actually quite a strange idea if you think about it. I mean, Switzerland, it's actually the European nation, if I understand correctly, that has the most official languages between French, German, French, German, Italian, and Romansh. And anecdotally, I want to say there's a lot of weird kookiness there. I mean, I just went to visit this summer on holiday, and they invented LSD over there. But anyways, Swiss design and Swiss typography ended up being internationally recognized as a kind of sober, neutral graphic design that championed uniformity and monovocality. On the other hand, I come from the USA, where we experienced our own aftermath and also reaction to Swiss modernism. Like, there were all the new wave designs of Swiss-trained practitioners like April Greiman and Dan Friedman, and experimental type foundries like Emigre, as well as many, many others who all challenged a kind of hegemonic typographic approach and championed, rather, diversity. And so, but here we are in 2020, and Things, which is my favorite app, hands down, like the majority of other websites, mobile apps, advertisements, and more in our current visual field, they seem to content themselves with a reduction to a single typographic family rather than mixing things up a little bit. And, I almost think it's like the equivalent of having like one monotone voice in which to speak because you are a robot. We are the Borg. Resistance is futile. Well, but I mean, what instead? I mean, I'm just making things up. But what if instead we thought about the rich interplay of typographic voices as a conversation, a dialogue, a community, even a chorus? Multifunctionality. So there's this pervasive and destructive modernist myth in design that design is meant to, quote, solve problems, often singular, narrowly defined short-term ones. This is not my approach. I believe very strongly that things should do multiple things in the world, ideally at different scales and in different modes and for different folks. So things should be expansive and ambitious in tackling multiple questions at once, much like this talk today, which you might say is like a mix of an app demonstration, a conceptual performance, a personal memoir, and a poor, very, very poor attempt at stand-up comedy. Okay, yeah, that didn't even make you laugh. Well, okay, that was embarrassing. All right, let's continue. But let me move on. Multifunctionality makes things more compelling, but it also allows things to endure into the future with an excess of functionality that makes these kinds of things more potentially resonant for future generations. It might mean sometimes that things are unwieldy, a bit longer, or more ungainly than a more streamlined equivalent. But that's a quality that I accept and would even embrace as part of the overall package, because see, I've never been a big fan of things that seem really neat and tidy and buttoned up, because to be frank, I don't really trust them. Things that leave some things out, things that are neatly streamlined to fit into certain formats, they might be easier to digest, but I think they also only give a partial picture rather than a more complex and multi-layered and richly textured story over time. Music. So music has always been part of my life. I mean, as a kid, my parents sent me to take tabla lessons, which is a kind of Indian form of hand drum. Da da terekita da da tinna. But and I learned from my weekly lessons. Plus, I think I once took a master class with the tabla player Zakir Hussain, if I'm not misremembering this. But well, I learned how to feel different polyrhythms that played against each other. And then I went on to play jazz guitar, which was a major part of my life until I left for college and then eventually went abroad to Germany. And I had to choose between a large format view camera and my guitar, and the camera won, and that was the end of that. But I still think that music is one of the most important and compelling models for how people make meaning together in the world. Whether it's listening to music, making music, dancing, singing, it's an intensely social activity and something that involves communing at a very deep level. And I had the very great luck to commune with a lot of wonderful musicians when I was in high school. One of them was Qasim Naqvi, a kind of composer and multi-talented musician. And he's gone on to have a very illustrious career across composition using graphic notation and polyrhythmic approaches to electronic and analog music. One of his groups is called Dawn of Media, and I'm just going to play a little bit of a track that is one of my favorite, albums of all time. It's called Dysnomia, and if you ever have a chance to listen to this on some platform, I'd highly recommend it. Dawn of Media. Well, again, that's Dawn of Medes Dystonia. It's like an hour-long epic musical composition. You can find that wherever you like to get your, streaming music or otherwise. Let's continue. Mythology. So I grew up reading Indian comic books called Amar Chitra Kathas. They were filled with, Hindu mythology, with gods and goddesses and heroes and demons. And I also read a lot of Greek myths, stories from half a world away. I mean, but I think the thing about mythologies, like the mythologies we have today, about what kinds of lives are worth living, who ought to be rewarded, and who ought to be punished, I think that we have to see them as being things that are fluid, things that are changed over time, and things that we can actively work to rewrite one day at a time. So let's see. Narrative theory. Okay, well, now, if I was forced, well, okay, it might actually be forcing me. I mean, more like if I were ever asked to talk about anything for a day or two nonstop, it might be the structure of novels. I mean, I'm not an expert. I never got any degrees in this. I mean, so I'm sure that there's some fancier folks amongst you who might want to put me in my place. But, I have read a bunch of novels and I liked them. And I mean, I've probably even done my proverbial 10,000 hours, according to Malcolm Gladwell's count. But did any of you actually read that book? I don't know if I actually read it. I think I just heard about the 10,000 hours. Anyways, well, let me summarize some of the ideas about narrative structures that I'm interested in by grounding them in specific examples. I'll try to do this quickly, I promise. So let me start. For example, I love that in Vikram Chandra's Sacred Games, that the narrative unfolds along two parallel interspersed paths. One following the life of the Mumbai gangster Ganesh Gaitonda, whose ghost actually relates the story of his life, and how he rose from a humble village background to become the head of a complex criminal underworld. And this strand intersects with staggered chapters describing a Sikh police detective in Mumbai who is trying to solve petty crimes. And of course, the whole thing ends up coming together in the end, but wow, in what a way. I'm not even going to spoil it for you. But this kind of alternating chapter structure where you move between different modes, from one section to the next, it's something that you can see in lots of books. Like I often think of George Perec's W, or The Memory of Childhood, or Ted Chiang's novella Stories of Your Life, which was adapted into the movie Arrival, and others examples. But the thing that's most fascinating for me about Chandra's Sacred Games is how it was produced, how it was written, because he actually used his years working as a programmer, which was his day job, between trying to write novels, to develop a custom CRM, a customer relation management software that tracked the appearance of his 100-odd main characters over the book's like 900 or so pages, so that he could run an analysis of the whole 900 pages, and he could see, oh, these characters haven't been mentioned in a while. They haven't been mentioned in 50 pages, and he could bring them back. And I mean, I think it was years ago, an acquaintance of mine, Rachel Donadio of the New York Times, she, did an interview with him about this. But I don't remember. I wish I had some custom software that could track all these past references all these bookmarks in my brain. But man, it reminds me, any of you ever heard the clown joke? I mean, my high school friend, my fellow Connecticut child of the South Asian diaspora, Prashant Rao, he used to tell this joke, this kind of endlessly long, intentionally digressive, shaggy dog kind of joke that could take up to a half hour or more. And it was barely even funny. I mean, it was mostly that Prashant just had this incredibly kind of warm and sly way of pulling you in, kind of teased you like a little bit of a, and it's just an exercise in storytelling for the sake of storytelling. And I mean, I don't want to ruin the joke if you ever get to hear it, but let's just say the punchline after this totally interminable buildup is, fuck you, clown. But I've never seen The Aristocrats. Maybe some of you have. I heard it has a similar premise. It's about this raunchy joke that comedians tell amongst themselves. But I don't know if I'd have the patience for it, really. Well, what's in a story? What's in a structure? I mean, I always remember my best high school teacher, Bob Cox. He told us that the audiences of Sophocles' Oedipus Rex knew the plot line and the ending of the story before they went in to see the play. And so these were these kind of cultural ritual stories where they were repeated year after year. The pleasure wasn't in like knowing or discovering the plot, but in experiencing the story and its performance time after time. And so, this is like reminds me of a mode more like something like Rachel Cusk's Outline trilogy, which I read a couple years ago. And the way that it's never the plot that carries your interest, it's actually the quality of the writing and the way that you kind of see the narrator's consciousness evolve and show itself through both what is said and what is not said. Or, Ocean Vuong's stunning, brutal book On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which is something like an autofiction, but with these forays into a beautiful, fragmented, poetic language that breaks and almost reimagines the form of the novel. Or something else that I just read last month is Han Kang's The Vegetarian, which I just read in a rush. I literally picked it up and couldn't put it down, read it in like 2 days. And it has these 3 discrete sections, I can count. 3 discrete sections, each with a distinct narrative voice that looks at these related events that are sequential, but from a specific embedded perspective. It's a little bit like Rashomon, but even further in the way that it kind of articulates a particular perspective. And the violence of the narrative, the stark pain that's embedded in it, it's performed through this juxtaposition of voices that allows the story to be felt in almost 360 degrees rather than being told or being seen. And, these are pretty short novels. I mean, which is a length that feels more contemporary. I mean, particularly, we're now trained to read social media posts and watch short videos instead of following some kind of a long story unfolding over time or even over chapters or serialized the way that Dickens's novels were, though I never read 19th century English novels, let me tell you. Now, nowadays, people just don't sit around by a campfire at night, every night or every week and listen to a tale unfolding. I mean, definitely not an epic poem or some sort of mythological tale. I mean, the short cycle of attention, the way that we're caught in these narratives that are very, very short term and don't actually create something kind of more long lasting. It's a kind of continuous cycle of bait and switch. And I'd say it allows certain heads of state that are performing right now in the USA, it allows them to divert attention from what's unfolding and keeping you only focused on the 140 characters that are at hand. But the human mind is a remarkable construct. It creates itself. In fact, it creates its very sense of the self within a retrospective frame. I mean, some people like Carlo Rovelli, the quantum physicist and scientist, he would argue that memory, the ability to integrate details spread out over time, is actually what constitutes and creates the idea of a bounded self. And this self, this organism, it can take in a lot of details in different formats. For example, years ago, my friend Tim Aubrey, who is a brilliant, totally awkward professor and writer, and he taught me a lot of what I know about books, and he's still read many more than me. I mean, he told me I needed to watch The Wire. This was probably, I don't know, 2005, 2006, whenever that show came out. And I said, some of you watch this. I actually never watched it. I've never been very good at TV. But I understand that the show is a kind of richly multi-layered portrait of the city of Baltimore and its power structures. But in his estimation, again, this was a long time ago, but he might have changed his mind. Sorry, Tim, too, if you've changed your mind about this. But back then he said that The Wire was better than, it was one of the best and most complexly structured narratives of our time or any time. And that, it could integrate all these subplots and motivations. And it really, was better than, it was better than any contemporary novel. And, last year at his recommendation, I read this book by Carolyn Levine, her brilliant work of literary criticism, Forms. And, this is, I think it's from 2016, 2017, but fact checking isn't my forte. But this book, Forms by Carolyn Levine, it tries to reconcile a formalist approach to literature, one that focuses on the aesthetic structures of a work, with a historicist approach, one that, as I understand it in my limited way, deals with context, history, and the political ideologies of writing. And it's a fantastic read. And she actually ends her book with a brilliant chapter on The Wire, and that seems to affirm Tim's analysis from back in the day. But I mean, as I said, I don't watch a lot of TV shows. I mean, I wish I did, but I'm more of an analog kind of guy. I mean, I read physical books even. I don't even read on my Kindle. Um, but for me, I mean, a book is something like the sprawling, interwoven political book of like W.G. Sebald's Die Ringe de Saturn, The Rings of Saturn, which is this kind of expansive masterwork that is about everything in the world. And, instead of winging it, I may as well read a short selection from my own somewhat sprawling and ever-changing electronic book, P!DF, which is probably more eloquent than what I can pull off right now. And so, it's also good to introduce a real citation. Makes me seem a little more academic, even though it's a citation to a book of my own that happens to be an electronic book. That's always changing. But anyways, so I'll just read this paragraph about W.G. Sebald's Die Ringe de Saturn. It's a strange hybrid, a novel that confounds fiction and nonfiction, historical fact with embedded memoir. The book's first-person narrator, not to be conflated entirely with its author, travels the landscape of contemporary England. His encounters with people and places serve as a starting point for interwoven digressions on colonialism, capitalism, war, memory, and beyond. The Rings of Saturn is a spellbinding, puzzling book, not the least because of its unusual visual structure. Within a cascading flow of textual narration, including single sentences that sometimes run over multiple pages, images appear abruptly without captioning or provenance. Are they illustrations, historical documents, proofs of the artist's presence and the book's own truth value, or something even more particular? Then the images, I'll just skip ahead for a second. The image's narrative instability lends them a mysterious power. It's the opposite of responsible curating or design that contextualize their contents precisely. Also, unlike documentary or didactic pictures, the images are not trying too hard to make a point. Here, in the shifting space between fact and fiction, verity and myth-making, an imprecise kind of knowledge emerges, apart from contemporary modes of address. But sorry, I digress. Sorry, I just love The Rings of Saturn so much. I mean, but I don't need to try to recreate Tristram Shandy, which actually, truth be told, I never read in its entirety here. So, well, my last example for the time being, and sorry, a lot of white dudes. I didn't expect that, but I'm broadening my reading every day. Georges Perec, he had his own ingenious method for structuring his last greatest work, Life, a User's Manual. Now, my French is nearly non-existent. I can say like un, deux, trois, quatre, or I'm sorry. I mean, yeah, I can't even, the original French, it's like la vie, mot d'emploi, but sorry, it sounds kind of Germanic. Well, anyways, my 16-year-old stepson, he's leaving for La Réunion in the Indian Ocean next week for a year. And so hopefully he'll come back and he can tell me how to pronounce shit like that. But anyways, you could call Georges Perec's Life, a User's Manual a kind of manual algorithm, since he actually also used a complex mathematical formula to organize the appearance of subplots and objects and even specific phrases into the 99 chapters of the book. And the book is intentionally incomplete. There is never a 100th chapter in this kind of complex structure. And so I think it's a very particular and generative system. But all this construction aside, what I really remember from the first time I read it in college, I remember very vividly that I thought it was just this very inventive, conceptual, and yet wholly entertaining, nearly realist novel, rather than something that was highly kind of constructed and crafted and kind of made through this algorithm. I mean, I didn't even know about the structures that organized it until after I finished reading it. And this might be a kind of manifestation of the Patrick Pulsinger principle, which some of you who were here at the first episode might have heard me talk about. But it's something my friend, the graphic designer Florian Brendel, told me about 20 years ago. Without repeating too much or being too boring, I'll get to the punchline. I mean, what I call the Patrick Pulsinger principle is the idea, possibly apocryphal, but it's attributed to the eponymous Viennese DJ, that when you're making a work of art, it might unfold as a generative process where you build the whole thing around a single idea or existing structure or sample. But then the last move to finish the work is actually to remove the very thing that inspired it in the first place. Then the entire work actually dances around this missing structure, this absence, this creative spark that started it and now has gone somewhere else. And so, it'd be like if I did this whole talk, but I left out the things app. I mean, that wouldn't make any sense at all. I mean, this whole talk is about things. Yeah. So, anyways, back to Perec. In a way, you could see his whole structure as a kind of failure. If you think of it in terms of completeness and making something resolve neatly. But then again, his whole book, maybe even his entire life from his childhood, his very traumatic childhood on, was about failure. It was about the failure of systems, especially when they're laid out in advance, when they control and they shepherd and they annihilate people and lives and generations. And there's that line by Robert Burns, the best laid schemes o' mice and men gang oft aglee, that the best laid plans often go awry. So maybe Georges Perec's ability to fail is actually the best thing. Why this book, Life: A User's Manual, functions as a microcosm of the entire world. It's got this sheer narrative wonder and intensely conceptual structure. And it also has the fact that for as carefully and thoughtfully and playfully constructed it is, it doesn't succeed at this construction. Maybe it doesn't even try to succeed doesn't even try to succeed to be complete and resolved. Well, anyways, I've clearly failed with what I set out to do with this particular tag. Neuroscience. Strange, a couple of my best friends from college who all played in a band together, that their best song or their most iconic song was Iguana. But they studied literature and art and other humanities in college, but then they all turned their work to the hard sciences, neuroscience and clinical psychology in particular. And they probably figured out something that I never did. Oneness. Small things like the totality of the world and other stuff. I mean, just like little stuff, like the realization that consciousness is not a thing that's contained within an individual body, but is rather a property distributed throughout the universe, within matter of all forms, and the porosity and openness of what seem to be closed systems, those kinds of things. Ordering systems. You can call me a pathological pencil pusher, or maybe nowadays a Google Doc pusher, but I really like ordering systems. I mean, maybe it's a way to compensate for the fact that actually I am a deeply unorganized person at my core. I'm very associative, I'm very intuitive, never really taken a Myers-Briggs test, but I get whatever, set of letters says intuitive and crazy or something. But because of that, I love a good filing system. I mean, in my 20s, I realized in my bachelor pad in New York, if you gave me a couple of drinks with my friends, I would good cue. After I went out with a couple of my friends and came home, the thing I liked to most do was organize filing folders, hanging filing folders. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But, you know, it may sound contradictory to some of the claims I've made about, the ideology of existing display systems and interfaces, but I'm actually a big fan of some existing systems, even the order of the Latin or the Roman alphabet, especially when they seem really arbitrary. I mean, of course, there was a motivation for why the letters are the way they are in our particular script. And, from a linguistic or typographic or archaeological perspective, we can look at, how the aleph came from an ox's head and all of these other things. But I think the fact that they're so old, even if they're still constructed, that makes them nearly impossible to disentangle from the cultural and individual categories of human experience. And when I was having lunch recently in Amsterdam with David Allen, who wrote Getting Things Done, and he made a very good point. I said to him, I said, "Hey, David, some people might say you're dogmatic, in your systems for ordering things." And he said, "Well, listen, hey, I'm just telling people what I think are the best ways to order and clean up their systems so that they can do other things." Like he said, there are always going to be systems, like the line running down the middle of the road. And the reason why you have a line running down the middle of a road, and other shared systems, it means that you don't have to worry about other things like getting hit by another car. And so it's almost like I have this desire to question and challenge certain structures, especially some of the social, economic, and political ones that are currently in place. But on the other hand, I embrace the kind of arbitrariness of certain systems as they can be used to order very disparate contents. And, for example, there's the well-known structure of the abecedarium, one word at a time. One letter alphabetically at a time. But I used to be really into this. I did a lot of abecedariums with my old graphic design firm, Project Projects. They're children's books by people like Bruno Munari and everybody else that go through the letter. But I've given up on this in some ways, because actually, even a very arbitrary system like just the order of the letters in the Roman alphabet, you can really game that system too. Like I've heard about parents who have really, especially in New York, parents who have kids and they name them with an A so that the kid's going to be at the front of the classroom and get called on. And maybe it even makes them smarter or more successful or something else. Really, God, I wish I didn't have to think about these things, but we always have to think about systems and structures. But there's any list of things. I mean, there's the famous, any list of things has some sort of logic. And there's that famous one that the writer, I'm gonna, Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, he talks about the one with the categories in a Chinese encyclopedia that's so telling. And well, I may as well just read the preface to the French philosopher Michel Foucault's The Order of Things, which, again, full disclosure, I never really read in its entirety, or maybe I did, but I was in college and I was probably, smoking pot or something. And so it's just a way to say, don't worry if you never make it through this whole 5-part series that I'm doing. I totally understand. I mean, probably, you just have to get the gist of it. But let me just read the preface of Foucault's The Order of Things. This book first arose out of a passage in Borges, out of the laughter that shattered, as I read the passage, all the familiar landmarks of my thought, our thoughts that bear the stamp of our age and geography, breaking up all the ordered surfaces and all the planes with which we are accustomed to tame the wild profusion of existing things, and continuing long afterwards to disturb and threaten with collapse our age-old distinctions between the same and the other. This passage quotes a, quote, certain in Chinese encyclopedia, end quote, in which it is written that, quote, animals are divided into A, belonging to the emperor, B, embalmed, C, tame, D, suckling pigs, E, sirens, F, fabulous, G, stray dogs, H, included in the present classification, I, frenzied, J, innumerable, K, drawn with a very fine camel hair brush, L, etc., M, having just broken the water pitcher, N, that from a long way off look like flies, end quote. In the wonderment of this taxonomy, the thing we apprehend in one great leap, the thing that, by means of the fable, is demonstrated as the exotic charm of another system of thought, is the limitation of our own, the stark impossibility of thinking that. Now, organizational forms. How a group of people come together, what structures those interactions. I mean, these are all things I've spent a couple of decades working on in a very practical and pedagogical way, but I'd like to spend even more time thinking about it. And I mean, actually, in a couple of weeks, I'll be participating in a workshop and training run by the social tech entrepreneur and organizer, Richard D. Bartlett, as part of what he calls microsolidarity. I mean, it's a set of protocols for how to create decentralized, mutually supporting groups rather than the typical hierarchical models that we're mostly used to in the contemporary world. And it's based in many ways out of systems that already exist within indigenous and other traditions, but it's simply adapted for folks like me who have grown up within a society that's based more on competition than on care for others. Otherness. This is an important one for me. I mean, everyone has different positions, backgrounds, and ideas. And I believe that this richness is one of the most important things in the world. It's also what keeps things from getting boring. But it's also fundamental for me because I grew up as an Indian immigrant in a pretty homogenous suburban Connecticut community. If otherness were not a viable option, then I wouldn't even be here today. And I mean, I suppose that I could try to be more academic, more, less personal, more scientific, and ground my interest in otherness in something like a model of biodiversity or some other discourse. I mean, I'm still looking for how to argue in a convincing way, apart from my gut feeling that diversity and embracing other people and other things or creatures, um, who are or actors who are different from you, and also embracing unfamiliar ideas, it's not just good and ethical, which I think they are, but that it's also useful or some other value that other kinds of folks might think is important. And I mean, especially since I'm pretty sure I'm going to find myself in a room before long. I mean, probably when I go to Ohio when I go to Ohio in October and try to register voters and work on my triennial out there, I'm going to be confronted by people who are at the other end of one political spectrum or another, and people who want to tell me that sameness is much more important than otherness, and that otherness ought to be eliminated. And so, I mean, actually, since we've got such smart folks over here, I mean, if any of you over there, if any of you know over there, any of you down there, I mean, if you want to put into the chat, just it's on the side of the interface, you know, if you have any ideas on how to convince people that otherness, diversity, difference themselves are intrinsically a value, please put them in the chat. I could really use it. And, for now, I'll just have to practice what I preach, which is when I'm confronted by something that is so different to my expectation or challenges it or tries to shut me out of the possibility of existing, I try to take a deep breath and let it out, and another deep breath. And I slowly try to listen to what others who are different than me have to say. And then I try my best to understand why they believe what they believe and where these ideas come from. Pedagogy. Well, for some folks, pedagogy has a really bad hierarchical institutional ring to it. Do any of you feel that way? Raise your hand. I definitely raise your hand right now. I feel like pedagogy always kind of creep me out. I mean, but I think that if we just reframe it to be about learning mutually, I mean, the learning that happens between any kinds of folks, whether it's the so-called teachers or the so-called students in all these different directions, then it might sit better with people. I mean, the idea of pedagogy. And I mean, learning is about discomfort. It's about being challenged. It's about risk. And that's why I'm here today, to kind of talk with you all. And I hope that's why you are too. But I mean, of course, as always, if you disagree with what I'm saying, then just put it into the chat right now. I'd love to hear your thoughts and we can learn together. Okay. Performative design. I think this whole talk is a pretty good example of that. Performativity. I Love you all. Phenomenology. Okay, this one's a pretty tough one. I mean, there's a lot to say here, but I can't get into it right now. We'll do that in another one. But for now, let's just stay with the experience of being here and how we might describe it. Philosophy. Now, I mean, I went to college thinking I'd study art, math, and philosophy. I did okay at the first, not so well at the second, and fine at the third. I mean, art was fun and creative. And since I had almost no training and very few expectations to start, and even studying it was an affront to my parents, I could actually enjoy it because it was rebellious and it was something new. I mean, math, on the other hand, my mom has a math degree, and I was terrible at it. I mean, I did AP calculus in high school. I was privileged enough to do that, but then the intro course, multivariable calc or whatever the hell it was in college, it killed me. And so, I dropped that like a hot cup of coffee. And, I like counting. Okay, I can count pretty high, but no complex math for me. I mean, philosophy, to be honest, was the most ambivalent one because I really loved philosophy. I loved it more than anything else. It was kind of like poetry for me. I just wanted to spend all my time reading it, doing it. I liked how dense it was. It was complex. There were all these like kind of ideas, but I fell asleep while reading it, also because I was narcoleptic. But you know, I never felt smart enough to actually pursue it. I mean, to be a philosopher, you have to be really fucking damn smart. So, I know some people like Ian Blecker. He is a philosopher. That is cool. I couldn't do that. But during a semester abroad in Germany, in Berlin in 1996 or 97, I had a friend, a Dutch grad student, who actually had a business card that just had her name on it and the profession, philosopher. And I was totally scandalized. I was like, you can't just write that you're a philosopher on business card. I mean, especially not when you're in your 20s, come on. But maybe that's the thing. Like, you just need to keep calling yourself something. You just have to keep naming yourself something enough times and through the utter embarrassment of it until it actually manifests. Well, last week I talked about role playing, but there's also the role of play itself in society. And you might have read, I can never pronounce Johann Huizinga, the Homo Ludens, about human as a playing animal. But well, okay. To be honest, I haven't even read it myself entirely. I mean, no, no, I'm just playing with you. Well, actually, no, I've never read it. But anyways, I think that there's something about uncertainty, about having and testing out new boundaries, about learning how the world responds that's inherent in play. And that's its own distinct pleasure. Pleasure. Pleasure is really important. Mm. Well, I mean, have you ever read? I mean, I've been reading Adrienne Murray Brown's most recent book, Pleasure Activism. It's definitely improving my days. Poetry is a new and an old interest of mine. I don't have a lot more to say about it for now, but I think it's something I'll spend more days with. Political action. So I used to buy that famous distinction that the filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard made between making political films and making films politically. I mean, his argument is that the structures of how a work is produced should themselves be political rather than just the message. And maybe it is because of the constraints of working within a capitalist economic system, but I've definitely spent the last 20 years of my life focused primarily on the second part of Godard's statement. But I think it might be time that I need to spend some more time on the first. Polyamory. Well, actually, I mean, I have to say this is always out of date. Polyamory is a bit more of like a theme. It's like a hobby for reading, a thought experiment, but it's really an old idea of myself that I don't think is very relevant. So I should probably just delete this one. That's the great thing about things. You can just delete a tag. Great. So polymathic practitioners. So everyone does many things. I mean, it's just hard for most people, particularly within today's professional context, to be understood as more than a single category. For example, like I've had the pleasure to know and have learned from a bunch of folks who've received well deserved recognition across multiple fields. I'll just name some people who I really admire, who have done so many things in different ways. And this includes people like Assad Raza, Brian O'Doherty, Celine Condarelli, Christopher Coulendrin Thomas, David Reinfert, Elaine Lustig Cohen, S.N. Carroll, Jace Clayton, James Wines, Jason Moran, Josiah McElhenney, Judith Berry, Julie Alt, Camila Janan Rashid, Kit Yi Wong, Martin Beck, R.A. Washington, Renee Green, Shuman Bazar, Zia Haider Rahman. The list goes on and on and on. I mean, but actually the truth is the list should be approximately 7.8 billion long. It should include every single human being in the category of polymathic practitioners, since actually every person has and should be able to exercise a manifold of possibilities. But I think it's a very hard position to be a polymath these days. I mean, to do more than one thing with love and care in a way that's actually valued is extremely hard to do and reconcile with the capitalist structure that wants everyone to only do one thing well. And this structure wants you to do one thing well, be relatively to moderately to extremely alienated from that one thing, and then to take all of that latent dissatisfaction and channel it into additional purchasing power and consumption and even violence against each other's to continue to feed the cycle. I mean, this, in addition to the structural inequalities that make it difficult for most people to survive, let alone thrive freely, is why there aren't more polymaths in the world. People who can follow their paths of joy and creativity into disparate fields and inquiries. This is particularly true if the folks we're talking about are people of color, women, queer folks, or don't otherwise fit into the most dominant categories. And even as a white man, with the structural advantages that come with it, it can take a damn long time. I mean, I was recently talking, years ago, I talked to Karl Martens, actually, who's now in his early 80s, and the Dutch graphic designer and more. And I said to me, I said, sorry, I asked him, I said, how should I call you? Should I call you a graphic designer? Should I call you an artist, a teacher, or something else? And he just said, hey, Blaine, I'm a human being. And which is, I love that as a statement. It's a statement that you are your whole person. But I bet he couldn't have said that a couple of decades ago when he was still struggling as an independent graphic designer with 3 children and a family. You don't get to do that then. Practice and rehearsal. So the sociologist and philosopher Richard Sennett makes a distinction in his 2012 book, Together, between practice, which he claims, particularly in the orchestral and musical context, is individual, and rehearsal, which is collective and involves multiple actors coming together. I mean, I'm both intrigued by and a little skeptical of this distinction. I mean, suffice to say, what we're doing right now, what I'm performing, or what we're all performing together, is both a kind of practice. It's an individual action that I've recorded alone for myself as a way to prototype ideas and thinking solo, but it's also a thing that I'm rehearsing with you all as a way to engage with everyone and hear how it resonates or doesn't into your own thinking and your own experience. And so, one of my maxims is that presentation is practice. A thing that seems to be about public premiering is also a form of individual learning and vice versa. So I hope we can explore over the next couple of sessions this kind of space together. Okay, I'm going to take a beer before the next one. Privilege. This is a very tough topic, but it's one that's really important to address these days. It's one that a lot of people don't talk about, they don't want to think about. I mean, the privilege that's embedded in their particular position. I mean, this is what leads people to say about others, well, why can't you just get up and succeed? What's so hard? And I think that this is something I need to work on more in my work and in my life. And so I'm just going to go back and talk a little bit about my privilege, or some of it, as I see it. So mean, it depends on how far back I go, but for sure it starts well before my birth. I mean, maybe even something like 3,500 years ago or so, when the ancient texts of Hinduism laid out different castes, separate categories of humans based on their professions and activities and really their race, the color of their skin and their origin, that were decided through birth, which they decided who was included and who was excluded. So my family are Brahmins, and as I understand it, I mean, I've never lived in India, so I'm a little bit removed from it, but we were at the top of this ancient, long-standing pecking order. We still are. Brahmins were the priestly caste, the caste who held spiritual power. They valued education and knowledge. They accumulated it. And that also meant that they had access to opportunities, to power. And this was the position from which they could dominate, oppress, exclude, and dehumanize others, particularly the so called untouchables. So, this Brahmin caste was inbuilt into their position and given to them by birth. Now, I'm not a historian of modern India, and I know some folks in my family with some different political opinions than me might get into an argument about, they might say, well, you had affirmative action in India in the 60s, and most of the spots at the universities were held for people who were not from the upper castes, and that these folks from lower castes, even if they had been systematically dispossessed and disenfranchised for thousands of years before, they took all of these places in the universities so that they couldn't study anymore. I mean, I can't argue intelligently with them, but yeah, I think there's some problems in the argument that I find. But my parents were privileged enough through their background and access to education and visas to emigrate to the US in the 1960s, where they could start a new life. I mean, where they had the opportunity to start a new life, something that a lot of folks never have. And I mean, mom and dad, if you're listening to this, I just want to say, I mean, I'm not trying to belittle or demean what you've both accomplished and how damn hard you worked. I mean, I know that when you came to the US, you spent some of your time as poor students and workers, and that you were on food stamps. And I know, in fact, I mean, it even stays in my body most days. I know that this experience of being poor and needy and scared and alone, it marked your approach, and it made you for a while even more careful and hardworking, and ultimately, after a while, even more ambitious and successful. I mean, you both worked hard, you found jobs, you made professions amidst the uncertainty and tough times that you had in the 1970s. You saved money and provided for us and kept on saving. You did this to make a life for us, your kids. And that's pretty selfless. It's pretty amazing and admirable. And you did make a very good life for us. I mean, because even if I grew up as a kid constantly hearing my parents talk about money, argue about money, being extremely careful, worrying about it, stressing about it, even if that was the talk, actually, if I look back in my experience, there was never a lack of money when we needed it. I mean, we had a nice house in the suburbs in Connecticut. We went to summer camps, we went on vacations, we ate out occasionally. Sure, we weren't allowed to drink soft drinks and we had to eat everything on our plate, or get in trouble. I mean, we could never waste food, but who didn't? I mean, I think that everybody had that. And I went to a nice public school, and we had a choice of three foreign languages from sixth or seventh grade. That's how I can speak German. We had AP subjects, and we had great extracurricular activities like debate and quiz bowl and all these other things I did. And so I wanted to learn how to play guitar, so I took guitar lessons. I got interested in breeding bronze catfish. I mean, don't ask me why. And so I bought some books on fish. I mean, I became interested in photography later, and so I bought a camera and a black and white darkroom at a the off of, I don't know, we didn't have eBay, I don't know, bought it somehow for cheap and installed it in the basement. And whatever money I made from my first jobs, from weed whacking my friends parents' backyards, to carrying furniture for folks at an antiques fair, to working at the bagel shop or typesetting a small printing house, I got to keep 100% of all of that money. And I used it to buy more books and more camera film and, Dunkin' Donuts iced coffee or whatever else I did back then. And the most important thing is that when it came time for me to apply to college, it wasn't even a question, it wasn't even a conversation that I would apply to the most elite universities in the USA. And we didn't even ever talk about the fact that if I got into one of my top choices, I'd be able to go to whichever one I wanted to go to without paying a dime of it myself. I mean, I still could go to college, could study really damn hard, could work my ass off. I could pull all-nighters every week for 4 years, could drive myself crazy, commit myself 150% to whatever I did. But the end of it, when I graduated, there would be no debt, there'd be no monthly payments, there'd be no ghosts from my past to keep me from pursuing the not always so lucrative things that I wanted to pursue, whether in art, graphic design, teaching, or later opening a gallery or reinventing myself and my personal and public persona. This is privilege. I believe that when you actually have the privilege to pursue your own individual self-knowledge and self-actualization, in a word, your own individual joy, then it can also become your pleasure to support others to achieve this for themselves. Protocols. Every system has inputs, ins and outs, rules and structures. I always want to understand any system's given protocols in order that they can be redesigned to enable maximum joy for all. Prototypes. Working from the understanding that everything you make is a prototype is also incredibly liberating. Punctuation. Now, okay, to be honest, I was so excited. Oh man, I'm gonna make this punctuation. I have a whole thing I wrote about this, but you know, I think I'm just gonna take a pause.
A friend of mine, the artist Wong Kit Yi, invited me to give a talk on punctuation as a kind of pause. She was relating it somehow to the global pause that certain sectors have encountered throughout the pandemic, and I thought this was a great idea. I had a lot to say about it, and I said, "Yeah, let's do it." So what I'm going to try to do right now is like a prototype of the talk that I'm going to do as part of her own performance. And so I'm going to test out some new material and see what you think about it. So let me roll up for this. So, okay. Thank you, Ali, for inviting me to give this short talk on punctuation, exclamation mark. From the first moment you asked, I knew it was the right talk and the right timing, colon. Literally, just a couple of weeks ago, while thinking about the fact that people, open parens, especially in Germany, close parens, keep calling me, quote, intense, quote, I considered trying to legally add an exclamation mark to the end of my name so that it would be, quote, Prame, exclamation mark, quote, M dash, then I could just point to that as the reason, or at least the justification, of my endless exuberance and energy, period. But, it turns out you can, apostrophe T, add a punctuation mark to your name, legally. M dash, at least not in the U period, S period, A period, period. But, seriously, punctuation is a fascinating topic. Bracket, unfortunately, I'm not quite sure how to render italics clearly in spoken language, unless I were to go one step further in absurd meta hyphen operations and start to read out every piece of markup that I might use to differentiate text, period. Anyways, period, bracket. My interest in punctuation goes back at least to college, when, during my semester abroad in Berlin, I took a highly influential, open parens, but also pretty sleep-inducing, which might have also had something to do with my as-yet-undiagnosed sleep apnea, close parens, lit course on deconstruction with Wilfried Menninghaus at the Freie Universität Berlin, period. The thing that most made an impression on me was something in Jacques Derrida apostrophe s of grammatology, which, because of the quote pause, quotation mark, in my occasionally brutal, periodic transatlantic travel schedule, happens to be in New York right now, rather than in Berlin, period. I so wish I could refer to those specific pages, photograph them, even, as I apostrophe V have been doing for other recent performance lectures, but I apostrophe L have to defer that idea for now, period. Well, as Derrida would have it, parens, or at least, as I remember it, it apostrophe S, Derrida, who talks about language and semiotics as an endless deferral, close parens, there apostrophe S, no original signifier, just an endless chain of signifiers, one behind the other, period. Quote, it apostrophe S turtles all the way down, quotation mark, as someone must have once said, open bracket, by the way, I, really, dislike the way that American orthographic standards put the comma in a sentence like the one before within quotation marks, rather than outside of the frame, period. I think the Brits have got this, at least, better, exclamation mark. They also have the pleasure of taking credit for the name of the Oxford or quote serial quote one of the few pieces of punctuation that enjoys a good song, the one by the somewhat twee yet still occasionally enjoyable band Vampire Weekend, quote, who gives a fuck about an Oxford, question mark. I apostrophe VE climb to Dharamsala, to quotation, period. If you don't apostrophe T know what an Oxford comma is, but still give a fuck, well, you can find out with one of my favorite and most hilarious open parens only question mark, close parens, punctuation comics that I often refer to, just Google quote, the strippers JFK and Stalin, quotation mark, and I believe you will land on it, period. Well, actually, come to think of it, you might want to just turn on your quotation private browsing quotation mode if you apostrophe RE on a public computer, just asterisk in case asterisk Google apostrophe S algorithms have changed since I delivered this talk, period, close bracket. Open bracket. I haven't apostrophe T even talked about exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, M dash, pronounced chick, 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 M dash, but I really never got that into them or listened to them, so let apostrophe S move on, period, bracket. Anywho, Derrida also has this great, very interesting thing about how the earliest forms of written Greek, parens, and probably other written languages, too, close parens, didn't, apostrophe T, have any spacing or punctuation at all, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. In fact, he describes this way that written Greek followed, quote, the way an ox plows, quote, M dash in a continuous stream of letters, from left to right, then on the next line from right to left, then right to left, then left to right again, etc., period, M dash, rather than even following one consistent direction, period. The reader just knew from the context and the flow where the words began and ended within this period. But, according to Derrida, open parens and, forgive me, any of you folks who have read this more recently than me, it was 1996 or 1997, I think, close parens, it apostrophe S, the spaces between words that changes everything, period. That apostrophe S, the first move, Once you go from spoken language, where one word ends and another begins can be quite ambiguous, Open parens, he uses comma, in particular, comma, a lot of French examples, comma, since that language, comma, I believe his first comma, has a lot of things that read differently from how they sound, period. For example, comma, whores, de, apostrophe, overs, comma, anyone, question mark. I still can barely spell M dash or say exclamation mark M dash, that one, exclamation mark, close parens, period. And comma, maybe he also says something about punctuation, comma, I imagine he must, period. But since I can't apostrophe T remember, open parens memory, comma, anyways being a thing that is most fixed in written language, comma, and which wanders in its spoken form, M dash. There's a great M dash, well, comma, actually kind of bad, but really interesting M dash short story by Ted Chiang that's all about the difference between memory and the idea of, quote, truth, quote, in a purely oral culture versus, period, what might happen in a culture in which, comma, through technology, comma, every single human experience is recorded and can be, quote, rewound, quote, to watch accurately, M dash. Well, comma, how these two radically different modes of memory might lead to an entirely different idea of, quote, truth, quote, period. Open bracket, there I go, comma, putting my periods outside of my quotes like the Brits again, exclamation mark, bracket, period. Anyways, comma, I guess I might not love the writing, comma, but it apostrophe s still a good enough story that I think about it a lot and felt I needed to cite it, period. Where was I going with this? Question mark. Oh, comma, right, colon. If, comma, for Derrida, comma, the spaces between words are what open up this chasm, comma, a kind of gulf between the spoken and written forms of language, comma, where suddenly what you see is distinguished from what you hear, comma, then I imagine he must have also had something smart to say about punctuation, period. But, comma, since I don't have those books, comma, what I would want to say, parens, and comma, I guess I apostrophe am saying it right now, comma, in a way, close parens, is that it apostrophe s the punctuation, comma, this nearly invisible set of meta hyphen marks, comma, which exist outside of how we speak or are only implied within it, comma, which also create this important and valuable gulf, period. Punctuation marks the move from a verbal into a written culture, period. A move where affect and emotion and feeling and rhythm must now be written into language, comma, rather than being part of a continuous performance, period. Punctuation is part of our everyday life today, comma, as we type and text and construct even emotive gestures, comma, affective illustrations through them, through it, semicolon, close parens. And, comma, it is part of how we work with orality today, M dash. For example, comma, when I try, open parens, unsuccessfully, comma, typically close parens, to avoid sore thumbs and voice dictate to my phone, M dash, it never knows whether to actually write, quote, open parenthesis, quote, as words, comma, or whether to make the mark for, quote, open parenthesis, quote, open parenthesis, though maybe I apostrophe am just not proficient enough in the language of voice dictation, M dash, maybe one of you millennials out there, comma, if there is still anyone who actually made it this far in the talk, comma, can send me a good link in the chat for how to do voice dictation better, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, close parens, period. Well, comma, anyways, comma, to zoom back out, colon, punctuation creates a frame, a separation between words, comma, ideas, M dash, a separation that apostrophe S, perhaps, comma, already implied in Derrida apostrophe S argument about spaces, M dash, but that mirrors the larger move away from connections, comma, oneness, comma, and towards individual words, comma, individual thoughts, comma, the myth of distance and separation and individuality itself, period. Punctuation, comma, in this framing, comma, is itself a frame for thinking, period. And, comma, so, comma, like any frame or display, comma, it is an ideological but necessary thing. Open parens, for nothing is without a frame, comma, right, question mark? There's nothing originary, close parens, comma. But it apostrophe s also is charged, it is potent, it is powerful, period. So, comma, what would a world without punctuation look, M dash, or, comma, perhaps, comma, sound, M dash, like, Question mark. Thank you.
Racism and anti-racism. This is a new but important one for me. I will let you know when I've finished reading or perhaps listening to the audiobook version of Ibram X. Kendi's book on this subject. Religion. I'll keep this one short, but for better or worse, as a Brahmin by birth, I believe it's safe to say that I was bred over thousands of years to become a priest. Until I was about 12 or 13, I thought, actually, this really confused my parents, but I thought that I would actually become a Hindu priest. And I pursued that until I eventually became totally turned off by the structures of organized religion, but also how they blocked your access to something bigger. They blocked your access to spirituality sometimes because of their power systems. And so I think there are other forms out there that could work. We just have to find or design them ourselves. Okay, well, it's getting pretty late, so let's see. We're on R for ritual. Okay, ritual. I like to learn from other people's rituals, particularly the most basic ones. If you follow someone like the German philosopher Byung-Chul Han, this is sadly mostly available in German, I believe, and his book on the disappearance of rituals, he would argue that it's these collective rituals that allow for community. So why don't we start with this one for now? Why don't you each, if you like, close your eyes, take a moment to breathe in and breathe out slowly. To breathe in and breathe out. To breathe in and breathe out. I'd like you to slowly open your eyes. And maybe you can take a moment to land in your body and then simply think, what is a daily ritual that you practice? For example, is there a way that you begin or end your day? Just breathe in, breathe out. Think about the answer, and if you can, take a moment to type your daily ritual into the chat window just next to this video. I'll give you a moment to do that. Oh, thank you. That's a really good one. Thank you. I appreciate it. Keep them coming. Thank you. Thank you for typing that. Now, I hope you don't feel like I'm trying to steal your rituals from you by asking you to type them and then saving them for future reference. But here's the thing. I think we each have our own little rituals. They're periodic structures and systems, little performances made for ourselves and for others. But we keep them so close to us. We're just so worried sometimes that someone else will take them from us. But what if we thought about these structures, these highly personal rituals, instead as tools? What if we thought of them as things that others can use? What if they were gifts that we let people steal, that we let people use? And then maybe we'd have a world in which our own little rituals, the things that help us make it through life day by day, would help other people while also teaching us each a couple of new things along the way. And so, with that in mind, I wanted to continue or end today's session with a ritual some of you will be familiar with by now. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. That was a great session today, and look forward to seeing you next week. Stay tuned for structures, and have a great rest of your week and days and all that. And I'm going to click end this recording right now. Thanks.